Good morning and welcome to virtual Friends for Life Indianapolis, our second session, Gary Scheiner, Making Sense of Sensor Data. I'd like to welcome everyone again. Just two notes, there are two attachments associated with this webinar in the handout area. One is the slide deck in PDF format for you to follow. And the second is a PDF with instructions on how to run the GoToWebinar software in case you're new to this and wanted some assistance. At the end of this session, we will have a brief 3-question survey. We would very much appreciate your feedback on how this all went. Also, during the webinar, there's an opportunity for you to submit some questions. Gary has asked that we hold all those questions for the end. But as you're thinking of them, enter them in, and we'll go ahead and make sure that those are all captured. I would also like to again, thank you all for joining us and give some special thanks to our sponsors, Lilly Diabetes, Dexcom, Insulet, Tandem Diabetes Care, and the American Diabetes Association. These organizations have stuck with us through these very interesting times and are helping us bring this to you at no cost. So Gary, I am going to turn off my camera and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Jeff. I want to especially thank Children with Diabetes for having the flexibility to produce this program in a virtual fashion. You know, obviously everybody is being affected by the coronavirus and the limitations that that's posed. So I think it shows a lot of intuition and guts for CWD to be flexible enough to make this happen. So thank you for that. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be discussing continuous glucose monitoring and with a focus really on the data part of it and how we can use it more effectively. My personal interest in CGM really blossomed about, I would say about 12 years ago. And I was actually at a CWD conference and was asked to present on hypoglycemia. So I'm sharing all of these bits of pearls of wisdom about how to prevent hypoglycemia. And I got about halfway through the presentation, again, on how to prevent hypoglycemia. And right in the middle of my talk, I started to feel a little bit shaky and jittery, started to sweat a bit, and you guessed it, I was having a low. So this is before I had been using CGM on a consistent basis, and it really proved to me the need for it. I'm one of those people with type 1 diabetes who really doesn't feel my symptoms of low blood sugar, and I know that that's very common among our clients. So I've been literally tethered to a CGM ever since that time. And I use the term CGM just in place of saying continuous glucose monitoring, just to save some time. So let's hop right in. Again, we're going to focus on how to improve our outcomes through use of CGM, because the fact is, the vast majority of people, even that are using CGM, are still not obtaining the kind of outcomes that they're looking for. Only about 20 to 25% of people with type 1 diabetes are meeting the A1C goals that the ADA has established, and hypoglycemia still runs rampant, and there's a lot of peaks and valleys in blood sugar levels. So we want to try to use this technology more effectively. So first thing we'll look at, just briefly, we'll go over some basics about how CGMs function, some of the different systems. We'll spend a fair amount of time discussing the real-time use. In other words, live, in this moment in time, how do we look at our CGM and know how to adjust things based on what we're seeing? And then we'll take a look at some of the download reports. These can be a bit intimidating to a lot of people. So we're going to do our best to break it down into very simple, basic terms so that, just about anybody can look at their own data and glean some insights to be able to fine-tune their own management. All right, so first let's dig into a few of the basics. And as Jeff mentioned, please, if you have questions, type them into the Q&A area. And at the end of the talk, we should have a decent amount of time to answer questions that come up. All right, so this is just a quick summation of the various options we currently have in continuous glucose monitoring. The system that is probably most widely known and used is the Dexcom G6. Medtronic also has a system called Guardian, and their Guardian sensor links up with their pump as well as with a phone app that displays data. Abbott has a system called Freestyle Libre, and Senseonics has an implantable sensor called Eversense. There are differences between these systems. Dexcom is recognized probably having the best accuracy on the market, particularly for a system that doesn't require any finger stick calibration. The Dexcom links its data with its own handheld receiver, but the data can also be picked up by a cell phone app. It can be picked up by a smartwatch or a number of different insulin pump systems. I mentioned Medtronic's system. It still requires multiple finger stick calibrations per day. It does link up with their Medtronic 670G pump to create a hybrid closed loop type of an algorithm. The Freestyle Libre doesn't require calibration. However, it's what we refer to as a flash monitor, in that the user has to actively scan the receiver over the sensor in order to obtain data. So the sensor is not transmitting a broad signal that can be picked up by the receiver at any time. So your glucose could be going low and you won't know it unless you're actively scanning the sensor right at that time. So the lack of alerts for highs and lows is one of the drawbacks to this Libre system. But Libre is fairly popular, particularly in the type 2 space, because it's a fairly low cost, very easy to use system. And the Senseonics Eversense I mentioned is an implantable system. The sensor it has to be implanted under the skin. It's usually on the back of the arm. And it sits there for 3 months, and there's a transmitter that tapes to the skin and emits a signal. So one advantage to this is you don't have to change your own sensors every week or two. Plus, the data is continuous. There's no warm-up periods every week or two that go along with that. And it transmits a signal right now just to their own cell phone app to emit alerts and display data for the user. So those are the personal use systems. We also have professional use systems that are used by healthcare clinics on a loaner basis. So just to collect data for a week or so, a week to 10 days generally, in order to evaluate a patient's glucose patterns. Let's see if I can get this to advance now. There we go. Now, the way these systems all work, really all have a similar design. There are 3 components. There's the sensor that sits below the skin. It's usually a metallic filament that's coated with an enzyme, and that enzyme reacts with glucose below the skin and generates a tiny electrical current along that filament. That signal is picked up by a transmitter, and the transmitter is a battery-powered device that emits a signal, and the signal is picked up by either a handheld device, a pump, a watch, or whatever is designed to link along with that system. All CGM systems are measuring the glucose in what's known as interstitial fluid. This is essentially the fluid below the skin surface. It's in the fat layer below the skin surface, which is where the sensor sits. And because it's not measuring the blood directly, there's a little bit of a lag time. So when your glucose is rising or falling, there's about a 5 to 10 minute lag time between a change in the blood sugar and when it finally shows up on the sensor. That's an important concept to keep in mind, especially when we begin speaking about setting the alerts when we want to be told our glucose is running high or low. So to understand lag time, I use a roller coaster analogy. Whatever glucose levels are rising, such as we see on screen, we have a roller coaster going up, the blood sugar tends to run higher than the sensor value. So think of it this way. The blood glucose meters have been on the market a long time. So they got in line first, and they got on the roller coaster first, and naturally they take the front seat. The sensor gets the back seat every time because it's a more recent development. So when the glucose is going up, the sensor is going to be lower than the actual blood sugar. When you get over the hill and start to drop, now the sensor in that back car is going to be a little bit higher than what the blood sugar shows. If you get on a roller coaster that I kind of like, a nice level one, things are in equilibrium. The blood glucose and the sensor glucose are usually pretty well matched up to each other. The lag time has implications, particularly during exercise, since the sensor is going to lag behind the finger stick reading. The lag time is actually a bit extended. It's more than just 5 or 10 minutes. And that has something to do with how the body uses fluid. And a lot of the interstitial fluid is drawn out to maintain blood pressure during exercise. So there's a bit more lag time when somebody's exercising. And with typical cardiovascular aerobic types of exercise, when glucose levels are falling, the sensor almost always overestimates blood sugar levels. And with anaerobic or high intensity interval training, when the glucose can be rising at the time, the sensor may actually underestimate what your blood sugar is. So those are things to keep in mind when you're looking at a CGM during a workout. I've actually had to create my own workouts at home since my gym's closed. I have a bunch of buckets with different amounts of dirt and water and rocks in them that I use for weights now. Hopefully all of you out there are staying up with your workouts somehow. Now, looking at the 3 things the CGM provides for us in real time, they all provide us with numbers on screen. We receive alerts when the glucose is starting to go high or low, and we get trending information showing a rise or a fall. And these things have different levels of value to different people. I mean, some people find the numbers to be the most valuable thing because they really just don't like doing finger sticks. So it's a good source of information. Others, and myself included, find the high and low alerts to be the most useful thing because we can't really sense when we're starting to trend out of range. Others find the trending information most useful, knowing when they're rising or falling and by how much so they can make better decisions. So let's look at the numbers first. How does a sensor compare to a meter in terms of accuracy? When we compare these, it's important to know that most meters don't use the statistic that CGMs use for evaluating accuracy. CGMs use a metric called MARD, M-A-R-D, and then that stands for mean absolute relative difference. In other words, it's the average percent difference between the sensor's value and a lab value taken at the same time. So you're not comparing a CGM to a meter, you're comparing it to a lab value. And when we obtain MARD values from meters, meters usually are measured by something called YSI, and there are certain metrics that the government requires. The government typically requires a meter to be within 15%, of a lab value almost all the time. But that's not the case with CGM. CGM, we just use MARD as the measurement. So with the Dexcom, we have a MARD of just under 10%. And with the Senseonics sensor, it's a little below that, but the Senseonics requires multiple calibrations each day. The Medtronic Guardian is a little above 10%. The Libre is a little above 11%. So in general, CGMs are around 10% when it comes to MARD, which, to be honest, is not bad because meters from previous generations, meters we used 10 years ago, had a MARD of about 10 or 11%. So the accuracy of the CGM is equivalent to meters we were using, just 10, 12 years ago. Some of the latest meters on the market, though, the more current meters, and I'm not talking about the generic ones, but more of the name brand meters, have MARDs of around 4 to 6%, which is fantastic for a home use device. So meters still are a little bit more accurate than the CGM, but the CGM accuracy is generally good enough for evaluation and for dosing purposes. So the question then is can these numbers be trusted? Now, back in 2015, and this is long before the government approved CGM as a tool for making decisions. You just say, well, it's informative, but you can't dose your insulin based on what the CGM says. Back then, a survey was conducted by the T1D exchange to find out, how many of you are actually using your CGM for calculating your insulin doses. And more than 80% said, yeah, we use the CGM already to dose our insulin. And we have a name for the other 19% of people. We call them liars because pretty much everybody was. They just didn't want to admit it. So bottom line, the numbers that CGM generates are trustworthy. However, we have to be intelligent about it. We can't just say we never need to finger stick anymore. We're just going to use our sensor data, because there are situations where the CGM is not reliable and you need to do a finger stick. For example, when you first begin using a CGM, I wouldn't trust it the first week you use it. Go through at least one full cycle with a sensor before you begin trusting it, just to learn the nuances of the system. On day one of a sensor, the accuracy is generally not that good. Many people have experienced this, and the data bears this out. On day one with most sensors, the accuracy is much worse than that 10% MARD. It's usually up around 20% or so. So when you first put a sensor on, it's best to do finger sticks for the remainder of that day. And then the next day, assuming things are working well, you can begin to trust your CGM. And by the way, the Dexcom G6 is one system where the day one accuracy is pretty darn good. You can usually trust it right away. And this is an interesting case. When somebody's recovering from hypoglycemia, it's best to not trust your sensor. And the reason, again, is because of lag time. There is a very long lag time when you have a low blood sugar and you're recovering from it. The blood flow to the skin surface is cut off dramatically when somebody's in a state of stress or crisis. So the change in blood sugar from the food you ate doesn't reach the sensor for quite some time. So after you've treated a low, your CGM might continue to read low, low, low for quite a while. And if you trust it, you're probably going to eat, and wind up excessively high. So if you treated a low, do a finger stick in 10 or 15 minutes to see if it started to come up, rather than just trusting the CGM. When glucose is rising or falling very quickly, best not to trust your CGM for dosing purposes, because there's likely to be a good discrepancy because of the lag time. If you did a finger stick and it was off by more than 20%, I wouldn't trust the CGM until you have a finger stick that matches up closer. Acetaminophen, and this is the ingredient found in Tylenol product. It's also found in a number of over-the-counter cough and cold medicines. Acetaminophen affects most sensors. It does not affect the Dexcom, and it also doesn't affect the implanted Senseonics sensor. But other sensors are affected by it. The reading will be artificially high after taking acetaminophen, so best not to trust it for at least 4 hours. And clearly, if your symptoms don't match what your CGM is telling you, go ahead and do a finger stick just to verify that it's functioning properly. All right, let's talk about the alerts now. We have three major types of alerts. We have high-low alerts, and it just tells you if you've crossed a certain line. And if you've gone above your high alert or below your low alert, you'll get an alarm. There are predictive alerts to let you know if you're about to cross that threshold. And we also have rate of change alerts to tell you if you're going up or down very quickly. Getting the settings right on these is very important if you really want to benefit from use of your CGM. With the high and low alerts, we really have to balance the benefit that they provide against the nuisance that they can become. Alerts should be meaningful, but not annoying. If they're happening too frequently, there's going to be a tendency to ignore them and not react to them. At the low end, I would recommend setting the low alert anywhere from 80 to 100. And the reason is because of lag time. In most cases, we want to keep glucose from going below 70. If you set your low alert at 70, you're not going to get the alert until the sensor thinks you're below 70 and falling. And remember lag time. If the sensor thinks you're below 70 and falling, your actual blood sugar is probably in the 50s, if not lower than that. So you need to catch these lows before they're low. So setting your low alert at 80, 85, 90 is much more effective. The high alerts can be a lot more flexible. Whenever I start somebody on a CGM, I usually tell them, just put the high alert at 300. Let's not worry so much right now about getting a lot of high alerts. Do we keep it at 300? No, I prefer not to, simply because we want to use this thing to tell us when we need to act on a high and not wait forever. We can gradually lower that high alert setting, but at the beginning, I don't like to set it too tight. Ultimately, I like to put the high alert at a place where we expect somebody to be after they eat, not before. So if we tell someone, let's say we want to keep your post-meal blood sugars below 200 and not get above 200, that ultimately would be a good place to set your high alert threshold. The predictive alerts have some value, and the reason they have limited value is that they're built on the assumption that the blood sugar is going to continue in a straight line from where it is currently, and that rarely happens. Glucose levels are always being affected by a lot of different things. In a way, these are kind of like weather reports. Trying to predict what's going to happen in 5 to 10 days is rarely correct. So if you are going to use a predictive alert, set it for a short time interval if you have that option. The rate of change alerts are really optional. Some people benefit from them. For example, those who are very, very serious and concerned about low blood sugar, you can use the fall rate alert to let you know if you're dropping quickly. The key is to know when to act on it. I mean, if your glucose is falling quickly and it's gone from 300 to 200, you don't need to act on that. But if it's falling quickly and you're below, say, 120, you probably do need to eat something. And the rise alert it's one I rarely use, but I have found some of my patients use it just to let them know if they might have missed taking insulin for a meal. Pumps have missed meal bolus alerts, but not many people use them. But if your glucose is shooting up all of a sudden very quickly, it might let you know you forgot to dose. But otherwise, it's not really necessary to know if your sugar's going up quickly, because it's going to do that after most meals anyway. The real value of these high and low alerts is to minimize the amount of time you spend outside of your target range. So if you take a look at this graphic, I tried to draw out what's going on. A typical person with diabetes generally is not that good at recognizing a slight high or even a slight low blood sugar. The glucose has to get pretty high or pretty low before we really feel any symptoms. I ask my patients this all the time. I say, can you tell if your blood sugar is 180 or 200? Most of the time, they can't really tell. It doesn't feel any different than being at 120. But the sensor is pretty good at telling us if the glucose has, they're starting to get a bit out of range. So in this example, you see the line going up out of the target zone. If somebody waits until they feel high or they do a finger stick at their next meal, they could be very high, and it could take a while to fix that. So what we see is the magnitude and the duration of the high is pretty excessive. Whereas if they catch it early, let's say they set their high alert at 200 and act on it then and fix it, they spend a lot less time in a high range. And at the low end, I think it's equally understandable that you can minimize the duration and severity of a low if you catch it early. If you wait until you feel low and your glucose is 58, you're already in trouble. It's going to stay low for a while. And by the way, the duration of a low is extremely important. Most people don't realize that that's more dangerous than just dropping very low all of a sudden. Prolonged hypoglycemia has been shown to lead to severe hypoglycemia. Dr. At Stanford University, this was evaluated by Bruce Buckingham. He studied CGM data in kids who had severe lows and found they typically had hypoglycemia for several hours before they either had a seizure or couldn't wake up. So minimizing the time you spend in a low range is imperative. And just as if you want to think of it this way, instead of that graph, the high and low alerts are kind of like bumper bowling. Instead of throwing the ball and winding up in the gutter, you've got a good chance of hitting the pins if there's something to bounce off of. So think of the high alerts and the low alerts, kind of like bumpers to help keep you on your alley and in a safe and healthy blood sugar range. And just as important as the alerts is your response to the alerts. This is essential. A high alert needs to be acted on right away, as does a low. And what I tell my patients is when you get a high or a low alert, don't think, just act. Have a specific course of action that you're going to take. With a high alert, anybody can hydrate. That's a good thing to do. You can engage in some physical activity. But I think most of us with type 1 would rather just give some insulin and fix it. And if you do that, make absolutely sure that you take your insulin on board into account. Now, pumps will do this for us automatically. Those on injections also need to consider insulin on board. And honestly, if anybody needs a chart that shows how to figure your insulin on board, just follow up after this program, send me a note, and I'll get a chart out to you. With a low, rapid-acting carbohydrate is going to be needed. You need rapid carbs right away to stop that downward trend. The earlier you catch the low, the less carb you're going to need. So if you're used to using 15 grams, for example, and you catch a low at 80, you probably can get away with 8 or 10 grams instead of the full treatment amount. Now, the trending information is another very valuable piece of information that CGMs give us. And I recognize these are some old school displays that I have on screen, but I thought it was interesting that they both showed the same glucose value. But with one, the glucose is trending down, with the other, it's trending up. The trending information helps us just make better decisions. There's a group out in California that did some research a few years ago and just counted the number of times that they, as type 1 diabetics, made decisions through the course of a day related to their blood sugar control. And they averaged over 40 decision points a day. A lot of things that we think about through the course of the day involving not just insulin, but food and activity and safety, etc. So knowing, when we need to eat, when we need to take insulin, when it's safe to exercise, it's all it's very helpful to know not just where we are, but also what direction we're headed. It provides context to these glucose levels. There's a big difference between a 128 that's falling and a 128 that's rising in terms of how we're going to act. Something that we teach our patients to do is adjust their insulin dose based on what direction the glucose is headed. And we try to treat each arrow state as about a 25-point blood sugar change. So if your glucose is trending up gradually, and this shows up as a diagonal arrow on the Dexcom, it shows up as one arrow on the Medtronic. This type of a trend, you got to figure your glucose is either going to go up or down about 25 points before things level off. With a straight up or down arrow, that's worth about a 50-point change. With a double up or down arrow, that's worth about 75 points. So in other words, if you're going into a meal with a glucose of 150 and a straight up arrow, you should dose as if that blood sugar was actually 200. So let me take you through a specific example. Let's say somebody has a correction factor of 30. So we're assuming 1 unit of insulin drops them 30 points. So what they would need to do, and obviously you'd need to be on a pump to dose with this kind of precision, but assuming that a unit or an arrow is going to affect you by 25 points, if you got a diagonal up arrow, you need about 0.8 units extra if the arrow is pointing up. So whatever your meal or correction calculation is, you would tack on an extra 0.8 with a diagonal up arrow. So here's a quiz question for you. I'm sorry, we don't have any interactive stuff set up, so you'll just have to answer this on your own. But let's say Betty Lou's blood sugar is rising going into lunch. What should she do? Should she take her usual dose based on her current blood sugar and carbs? Should she take her usual dose but wait to eat? Or is she going to need to take more than her usual dose? Now, the answer to that is C. She's going to need to take more than her usual dose because the glucose is rising. Given the same scenario, the same meal, the same blood sugar, if her glucose was stable, she would take her usual dose. If she was falling, she would take less. Another way we can utilize the trending information is to know when to say when. I mean, when do we need to fix an elevated reading? And I know a lot of us get a little over anxious and a little overzealous at correcting our highs. You know, the term angry bolus has become very popular among people with diabetes who just like to give insulin to fix anything that's elevated. And even looking beyond insulin on board, we also want to look at when the glucose has begun to break downwards. So you can see on this graph, 2 hours after a meal, the blood sugars are the same, but the person in orange, the glucose is already starting to trend down. The person in blue, it's not trending down. I would say the person in orange should probably leave it alone. It's likely to come back down to normal on its own. The person in blue needs to do a correction bolus to fix it. Okay, so let's shift gears a little now and take a look at what we can learn from our own CGM data. I recognize very few of us like to look at our own CGM data. And we got enough to do in our lives. Diabetes keeps us busy enough. Why take on one more chore? And I'll tell you, there is a lot we can learn from looking at our own data. I look at my patients' data for them, but I do encourage people to look at their own as well. But in most cases, when we look at these reports, this is how it feels. I mean, we can get very overwhelmed. There's a lot of information there. It looks ugly, and it can be an overwhelming experience. So my advice to you is when you're looking at your own CGM data, do not go into it with an open mind. If you go into it with an open mind, it is going to be overwhelming. Instead, go into it with an agenda. Have some specific things to look for. That's what we're going to explore now. You can evaluate your insulin doses for meals to see if they're the right amounts, as well as the correction doses. And we're going to look at examples of these in a moment. You can evaluate how long it takes your bolus insulin to work, how long it takes to finish working. You can see how high your glucose peaks after meals and whether you're stable overnight and between meals. You can evaluate patterns of hypoglycemia, what happens, not just when they happen, but what happens before them and after them. You can see how physical activity affects you and whether there are patterns based on the days of the week. And if you're logging any additional information besides what your pump might hold or your meter might hold, you can learn about cause and effect relationships related to a variety of different things. Even before looking at the graphs, I always like to dig into some of the statistics that a CGM provides. You know, for example, the average glucose. This is a really valuable number because it correlates very closely with the hemoglobin A1C. In some cases, it's not even necessary to do an A1C if you have the average off of the sensor, because you have a very good idea then of what your overall average glucose really is. The percentage of time that you spend above, below, and within your target range. This to me is more of a gold standard. This is a quality measure of glucose management. You can have an average or an A1C that looks pretty good, but have really poor control. You can be peaking up and going low and peaking and going low all day long. The average is fine, but that's not good management. We like to spend as much time as possible within a healthy range. Now, if you don't know what your target range is, it's something you should discuss with your physician or your diabetes educator, because that's an important thing to know. Now, my example, my own personal target is 70 to 160. I just feel comfortable in that range. Other people, the range is a little wider, others it's narrower or higher, but you should know what your target range is. Now, ultimately, we try to get at least 70% of a person's time in their target range. If it's above 70%, great. If it's well below that, there's some work that needs to be done. As far as the time below range, we would try to keep that as low as possible. 3% or less is desirable. The standard deviation is another metric that's useful to evaluate the quality of control. A small standard deviation means the blood sugars are pretty consistent. There's not a lot of significant peaks and valleys in the day. A high standard deviation means there is a lot of variability in the blood sugar. We like to see a standard deviation that's less than a third of the average. So if your average is 150, we'd like to see a standard deviation of 50 or less. And you can also quantify the number of times the glucose goes above or below your high-low alert thresholds. That's nice to compare from week to week or month to month. Let's look at a few of the specific graphs. And as we go through these, you'll notice that I prefer looking at these reports. They're called overlay reports. In the field, we call them spaghetti graphs because it looks like a bunch of just spaghetti thrown on a plate sometimes. But I find that these graphs are the most useful ones for picking out patterns, trends, and also seeing enough detail to figure out what's going on. So this is a 34-year-old pump user. He's using insulin to carb ratios, and what we find is that his breakfast dose is actually set properly. Even though he peaks after breakfast, he winds up back to a normal level by lunchtime. So that tells me that the amount of insulin he's getting at breakfast is probably fine. He may need to time it a little differently so he doesn't peak as high, but the amount is okay. But what about lunch? The lunch dose is not quite enough. He's normal at lunchtime and winds up a little bit elevated 3 to 4 hours later when that insulin finishes working. And similarly, at dinner, the dose is insufficient, not getting enough there because it's still elevated 3 to 4 hours after the meal. Now let's take a look at somebody on multiple injection therapy. This is an adult with type 1 diabetes taking multiple shots per day. 11% of his overall time is below target, which is pretty excessive. But what we found is that a lot of his lows were following correction boluses. So if somebody's going low after they're high, it means they're likely giving too much insulin to fix those high blood sugars. And that could be because they're just overdosing themselves, but it could also mean that their correction factor is set a little bit too low. So if they have a correction factor of 50, raising it to 60 or 70 would likely help to prevent a lot of their hypoglycemia. Let's take a look at the post-meal patterns. And again, a nice thing about the spaghetti graph is that you can visualize the high points that occur after meals. And they don't always happen at the same time of day. And that's why this type of a graph is the most useful one to look at. You can just visually or print it out and mark the high points after meals to just get a general sense of where the blood sugar hits its high point after each meal. So in this case, it looks like post-breakfast and post-dinner are moderately elevated, but post-lunch for some reason is extremely high. And that could be related to food choices. It could be related to the timing of the boluses. Obviously, bolusing earlier would be helpful. Choosing slower digesting foods would be helpful. Getting some physical activity after eating might be helpful. So if this is a student, it's a young adult, it might be a college student, they may be sitting in class right after lunch, and all they may be able to get for lunch is a sandwich, and bread tends to digest very quickly. So we might look for some other food options. Here's somebody whose blood sugar spikes so high after dinner that it doesn't even show up on the graph sometimes. And we know this is somebody who is on a pump, giving their insulin just as they're about to eat, and often has potatoes with dinner. So in his case, choosing a slower digesting carb at dinner. And ironically, sweet potatoes are caused less of a spike than regular potatoes do. It's one of those great ironies of diabetes. Sweet potatoes are a lot better for us than white potatoes are. But pre-bolusing, choosing slower acting foods would be useful for this person. And let's take a look at how basal insulin can be evaluated. As you know, basal insulin's job is to keep blood sugars flat and steady between meals and while we're sleeping. If your bolus insulin has cleared and your food is done digesting, the basal should keep you at a steady level. Now, that doesn't mean it should keep it at a specific number. It just means it should keep it where it's at. In this case, we have somebody who is not eating after 8 p.m., but their glucose is trending up through the night. So clearly, they're going to need an increase in their basal insulin dose during the night in order to keep things flat. Here's somebody on injection therapy, and they found that they had to eat something at bedtime without dosing for it, what we call an uncovered snack, just to prevent lows by morning. And that's the case. They are dropping overnight, which means that their injected basal insulin dose is set too high. And this person is taking, I believe, Lantus. But it doesn't matter if it's Lantus or Degludec or Tresiba or Basaglar, or whatever you're using. Any basal insulin that's causing the glucose to drop overnight needs to be reduced. Sometimes we have pump and sensor data combined in the same reports, which can be very helpful. Like in this case, we can see that in the afternoon, there was a long gap between breakfast and an early dinner. This person ate around 9 and then didn't eat again until about after 5. So we have an opportunity to evaluate their basal insulin in the afternoon. And things did hold pretty steady, which tells me that the basal insulin is working pretty well during that time. Now, the duration of insulin action is another key variable. Every pump asks for this, but even people on injections should have an idea of how long their rapid-acting insulin takes to clear, because you need to calculate your what's called insulin on board. If you gave yourself a dose of insulin at noon and at 2 o'clock your glucose is elevated, it helps to know, well, how much insulin is still in my body and should I give more at this point? To do that, you have to know how long your insulin takes to clear. Some people find that it takes 3 hours, some it takes 4 or 5. And in most cases, people are just given a number by their healthcare team without any real science behind it. It's just kind of a guess. But if you guess wrong, it can lead to problems. If you assume your insulin takes 3 hours to work and it really takes 4, then you're underestimating your insulin on board. If you assume it takes 4 hours and it really takes 3, then you're overestimating, and it's going to affect your insulin dosing negatively. So in this first graph, we have a 3-hour action curve. We see that a bolus was given around 6:30, 6:45, and around 9:30, 9:45, the blood sugar leveled off. So it took about 3 hours for that insulin to finish working. In the second graph, we have a 4-hour action curve. We have a bolus given around 12:30 in the morning, and it took until about 4:30 to officially level off. This last graph, this one was done over a meal, and it showed how it took 5 hours for the insulin to finish working. I usually prefer evaluating the bolus action on a correction dose only. It just eliminates a few variables, but I mean, you can do this. You can do it over a meal if you choose to. Again, this is an important number to get right. If you underestimate your duration of insulin action, then you are setting yourself up for a lot of low blood sugars because you're going to underestimate your insulin on board. If you overestimate your duration of action, you're setting yourself up for chronic high blood sugars because you're going to be deducting too much insulin on board just about all the time. This is a nice way of looking at patterns around hypoglycemia. And in this case, we have a college student who's having low blood sugars in the middle of the night on a consistent basis. And she contacted me simply because her glucose was running high in the late morning, early afternoon. She thought she needed more insulin at that time. But when we looked at her data and realized, well, these are all following lows, and we knew that the cause of the rising blood sugars was the hypoglycemia. Now, between you and me, we had a discussion and realized she just joined a sorority and she was drinking almost every night. That was the cause of the low. So we were able to have a frank discussion about the effects of alcohol on blood sugars. And we taught her that if she is going to drink, she needs to cut back on her insulin when she does. Some of the download programs will generate data that's broken out by days of the week. And sometimes you will pick up on patterns you didn't even know existed. Now, this is somebody who was having an inordinate number of low blood sugars on Thursdays. I don't know, didn't have any specific notion why, but a ton of low blood sugars on Thursdays. And we found out it was just related to physical activity taking place on Thursday mornings. We took a spin class or something of that nature. So we're able to hone in on that and just figure out a solution. But until you look at the data, it's hard to realize when those problems occur. And there's some other things that can affect glucose levels we can learn about from these reports. I thought we had a good opportunity to evaluate basal insulin because this patient hadn't eaten anything, pretty much anything all day, and hadn't bolus since about 6 a.m. until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And you can see how the blood sugar rose pretty sharply starting around noon. So you might think, well, their basal insulin might need to be increased late morning. But the fact is, they actually had a root canal that day. So we're able to learn about their response to stress. And if this is a patient who spends a lot of time at the dentist, they're going to need to learn either some relaxation techniques or to learn how to give extra insulin in anticipation of this kind of rise. This is an interesting case, and this is with a young man, a school-age kid, whose blood sugars were pretty stable overnight. If you look at the yellow graph, you'll see overnight, midnight to 8 a.m., they're usually in a decent holding level through the night. But occasionally we would see a night like the red line where they dropped and wound up with lows during early morning hours. And we traced it back to much harder workouts. His team would have them in the weight room and then doing running and cardio. That night is when his glucose would tend to drop. So the strategy we apply with him is to use a temporary basal adjustment overnight after those really hard workouts. And this was an interesting one. This is a family that would go out to dinner on Saturday nights. And we were able to generate a report just showing the Saturday night glucose data. And this is the only night of the week when glucose was rising like this. And the issue was the family would go out to dinner on Saturdays. So this little girl would have all of this fatty food for dinner, and that would cause her blood sugars to rise overnight. So we taught her how to raise her basal insulin on Saturday nights in order to offset that. All right. So again, when you're looking at these types of data reports, you don't have to do all of this at one time. I mean, it's a lot of work, but pick one or two things to look for. See if your meal or correction doses are working right. Try to measure the bolus action curve. See what your after meal blood sugars, how high they're peaking. Look for opportunities to evaluate the basal. Anytime there's more than 4 hours since the last meal and bolus, you can start looking at the glucose trend graph to see if it's holding steady or rising or falling. Find out when lows are occurring and what precedes them and what follows them. If you're always low after highs, maybe the correction dose is off. If you see lows followed by another low, maybe the treatment isn't enough. And see what's going on after the lows. Is the blood sugar rebounding and spiking very high? See what kind of effects physical activity is having. If you've added any medications or changed the medication program. And if you have software that lets you see data by day of the week, see if there's differences on different days of the week. And I'll just finish up with some we call ingredients for success. My colleagues and I all use CGM, and these are some of the things we found are helpful for getting the most from them and having a good experience. Go into it with the right expectations. CGM it's a wonderful tool. It doesn't replace finger sticks entirely, though. You still need to do finger sticks when the situation calls for it. And obviously, if you use a sensor that requires calibration, you'll need to do that anyway. And if you are using one that requires calibration, utilize a meter that gives you good, accurate data. Pick one of the better meters on the market. I mean, personally, I like the Contour Next. I think that's the most precise on the market. It's very simple to use. It's hard to foul it up. And make sure your finger is clean and you use proper technique if you're going to use that reading for calibration. I still remember going to a barbecue place in Kansas City and checking my glucose without cleaning my hand first. And it was about 400. I washed my hand and it was in the 100. So it does make a difference. Use your sensor consistently. It's not the kind of thing you should use for a few days and take it off, or use it for a week and take it off. Use it on an ongoing basis. That's how you're going to benefit. The data is meant for to use to your advantage. Don't over obsess about it, though. If you're looking at it constantly, you're liable to overreact to your information. If you look at it once an hour, that's probably a good frequency. Always take insulin on board into account. And I would add to that, I would say also take food on board into account. Now, if you just had a pasta meal a few hours ago and your glucose is trending down, it's probably going to reverse that trend pretty soon. Adjust your therapy based on repeated patterns, not just on one-time events. I get emails and calls from patients all the time saying, my sugar was low this morning. I was high yesterday evening. Let's adjust something. I say, well, was it that way the day before and the day before that? You got to look for patterns. Diabetes, we all know, no 2 days are alike. We have to look at patterns rather than individual events. I mentioned the calibration. If you have to calibrate a system, do it properly. Now, with the Dexcom, which doesn't require calibration, you still can calibrate it. If you do a finger stick and there's more than a 20% discrepancy, go ahead and calibrate. Nothing wrong with doing that. And at least at the beginning, make sure you minimize the nuisance alarms. High and low alerts are meant to be meaningful and useful to you. If you're not getting alarms until you're extremely high or low, that's not saving you. But if you're getting the alarms too frequently, you're going to tend to ignore them, and that's not going to help either. All right, so here's a quick look at some of my team members. I'm so proud of the team at my practice. All of our team members have type 1 diabetes or have a child with type 1 diabetes. And we come from a variety of different disciplines in nutrition and exercise and nursing and mental health. We offer all of our services remotely. We were doing that long before coronavirus kicked in. We've been providing virtual consultations since, probably around the year 2005. So about 15 years we've been doing that now. So there's my information. And if anybody has questions, we can address them now.
So Gary, this is Jeff. I just sent you a question assignment from one of our listeners.
All right. Well, I'll tell you, can you read the questions to me? Because I'm not seeing anything here on screen.
Sure. It says, my teenager seems to not even hear her CGM alarms and therefore not to look at the CGM and react. What can I do to get my teen to actually listen to and respond to CGM alarms?
Well, this is where you need to take a car battery and hook it up. No, I'm kidding. You don't want to hook a car battery up to your kid. I just wish there was a mechanical punching bag that could come out and hit a kid in the head once in a while when these alerts occur. Because kids will sometimes sleep through just about anything. Yeah, this is where using the shareable features that some sensors offer can be really useful. If a parent or a partner or a caregiver is alerted when things are getting into a dangerous range, if the child doesn't hear the alert, then the caregiver or parent can intervene. There's some creative things people have done as well. There's an earthquake app that you can install on your phone. So if your phone starts to vibrate or shake at all, it'll set off a blaring alarm, and that's something that kids will often hear. There's also some advantage to changing the type of alert on a regular basis. If you hear the same old beeps over and over again, they can kind of fade into the background. Sort of like my office backs up on train tracks. I don't hear the trains anymore because they just go by constantly. But if the sound changes dramatically, then you're more likely to notice. So change the alarm type. Dexcom has a lot of different alarms. There's like 25 different alert thresholds that can be set for the different types of tunes. So that's another option as well.
Okay, next question. Does hand sanitizer affect finger sticks and blood glucose readings?
Oh, it absolutely does. Yeah, you need to make sure your hand has been cleaned with soap and water and dried before doing the finger stick. Yeah, that's a very good question. So just about any substance on the finger, it doesn't have to be food, any kind of substance, a foreign substance on the finger on the finger can affect the accuracy of the reading. Great question.
So from another reader or listener, what about Afrezza?
What about Afrezza? Well, Afrezza is an inhaled insulin. It's inhaled into the lungs directly. It absorbs and acts very quickly. It doesn't really apply directly to our discussion today, but it is a way of delivering insulin. The insulin works about twice as fast as insulin that's injected, so it has beneficial effects for those who want to minimize post-meal blood sugar spikes. It can also bring high blood sugars down faster. However, it's a technique that has to be mastered. The dosing of Afrezza is a bit difficult because it can only be dosed in fairly rough increments. You can't get very precise with the dosing of Afrezza.
All right. Another question. When should we expect the Dexcom G7?
I wish I knew. I mean, it's been in development. It's being studied and tested right now. My guess is probably in the next, well, I would say before the coronavirus, I would have said it would be probably towards the fourth quarter of this year, but everything is probably delayed at this point. The company staff is not available to do a lot of the face-to-face things that need to be done. A lot of research studies have been put on hold. So I would guess somewhere in the next 6 to 12 months, but don't hold me to that. There's a lot of variables that can come into play.
All right, another question. When starting a new CGM session on the t:slim X2, do you recommend starting the sensor on the phone or on the pump or both?
It's perfectly fine to start it on either. They sync with each other, so you should be able to do either one. That only is with the Dexcom G6, obviously.
All right, so we have another question. What recommendations do you have for navigating CGM trends with Control IQ? It does work amazingly most of the time, but there are times I would like to intervene to keep in target. Sometimes I win, sometimes I pay for it.
I mean, there's a lot of strategies for just getting more utility out of the algorithm built into any hybrid closed loop system. Something that you can still do is you can adjust the bolus doses any way you like. So if you're going into a meal and your glucose is rising or falling, you don't have to take what the pump is recommending. You can adjust it. That's a way that you can apply your trending information. As far as using the trending information to change the algorithm, that's not something that you have the ability to do at this point. The algorithm for the basal adjustment is what it is. But when you're bolusing, that's something you have complete control over. We could probably develop a presentation, Jeff, just on hybrid closed loop technology and how to make better use of that. CGM does play a major role in that.
I'm guessing a session on that in the next couple of weeks would be of great interest as we all remain physically distant. All right, let me get a couple more questions in. With regard to menstruation, we may be seeing highs before and lower during. How do you track this with CGM to make changes?
Well, some of the CGM reports allow us to look at what we call a longitudinal graph. It'll show data over a couple of months. Excuse me, get some water.
While Gary's doing that, several of you have asked about the insulin on board chart. I will pass all of those on individually to Gary and encourage him to just put it up on his website.
Okay, the voice is about that. Yeah, so if you're looking at a longitudinal graph that shows data over a few months' time, you can evaluate if there's a phase of the month where glucoses are a little above or a little bit below the norm. You can also break your data out. You can look at a specific week or a specific 3 to 5 day period, and again, see if the averages and the time above, below, in range differ significantly from the rest of the month. You can always customize the time ranges when you're looking at your data.
All right, we have another question about Abbott Navigator. I began using an Abbott Navigator quite a few years ago and have a recollection that it measured blood glucose every minute rather than every 5 minutes. If 1 minute data were available, wouldn't identification of trends be quicker than data from 5 minute increments?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Navigator was a pretty effective system and probably a bit ahead of its time when it was available. And there's a trade-off between the frequency of the data and the accuracy. When data is generated every minute, there's more likelihood of erroneous readings because it's not really getting a data point every minute. It's collecting it every second or two and then averaging over a period of time. the more data you have, the truer the average is going to be. So there is a bit of a trade-off in that regard. I think most people would be willing to trade off a tiny bit of accuracy in favor of more frequent data generation, just because you don't want to wait to see if things are trending up or down. So we may see in future iterations of all of these systems, data generation more often than every 5 minutes, which is what most of them do now.
All right, I'm with us winding down. I'm going to give you the last question. What value do you place on the AGP report?
I differ with a lot of my colleagues on the value of the AGP. To me, the AGP is a very simplified version of the spaghetti graphs. The spaghetti graphs look scary. However, you can learn more from a spaghetti graph than you can from an AGP. I think if somebody is just very new to looking at their own data and easily intimidated by these graphs, the AGP is fine. The AGP is just kind of provides averages every few minutes in a graph form, and it shows shaded areas when the glucose is running above or below your target range, as opposed to a spaghetti graph, which also lets you see when you're running above and below. But the added benefit of a spaghetti type graph is you can see specific cause-effect relationships. You can evaluate what happened before the highs and lows and after them. You can follow a tracing for an individual day to see what was going on. You can see the post-meal patterns more clearly. So my preference is the spaghetti graph, but I guess when you're first getting started, an AGP can be useful just for seeing overall where your highs and lows are taking place.
All right. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this session on CGM, our second in our virtual Friends for Life Indianapolis conference. When I conclude this, you will all see a 3-question survey. Please give us your feedback on how this all went. Gary's email is up here for those of you who raised questions that I wasn't able to give to Gary during the call. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors, Lilly Diabetes, Dexcom, Insulet, Tandem Diabetes Care, and the American Diabetes Association. Everyone be well. We have another session starting in just 30 minutes. Bye-bye.